Hello everyone, my name is Brian Bilston. Thank you very much for tuning in. Before I get going with reading some poems, I'd like to start, as I often do, with an apology. Well, a couple of apologies actually. Firstly, as you can see, the state of my desk is an absolute disgrace. I can only say how sorry I am about that. I realise it doesn't reflect well on me as a person. Indeed, most likely brings shame upon the writing profession more broadly. It's no defence, I know, but I'm reminded on these occasions of Albert Einstein's quote about his famously untidy desk. "If an empty mind," he said, "is a sign of a cluttered desk..." No, hang on, that's not right. If a cluttered desk is empty of a tidy sign... No, that's not it. Oh. Hang on, I've got it written down here somewhere. Just bear with me a moment. Oh, no, look, it's no good, I can't find it. Look, I'll have a look for it again later. Anyhow, the second thing I'd like to apologise for is the ridiculousness of my hair. As we all know, a decent haircut is hard to come by right now. I don't usually look like this, I promise. I hope in no way this impairs your enjoyment of the next half an hour or so, but I fully understand if you'd like to end your viewing of this broadcast now. At this point, I'd like to thank all the bookshops who have somehow kept us stocked with books to entertain us or divert us or inform us over these difficult last few months. In particular, I'd like to mention the wonderful independent bookshop Bookish in Crickhowell. If you'd be interested in supporting them by buying a copy of my latest book, Diary of a Somebody, or indeed any other book, as I understand they stock a range of titles, not just my own, you can find them online at www.book-ish.co.uk. Okay then, over the next half an hour or so I'll be reading some of my poems to you, most of which I've had the pleasure of selecting myself. But first I'd like to start with a listener's request, sent in on this lovely lilac-scented notepaper. I don't know if you can smell this from where you are, but if I waft it in your direction, it really does carry a delightful odour. Anyway, the letter reads, "Dear Brian, as a lifelong fan, although only recently of you, I was hoping you might read your fabulous poem Frisbee. It's a poem that means a lot to me, not only for its poignant and melancholic imagery, but because it is short and I have little tolerance for poetry." And that's been sent in from a Mrs. Edith Bilston of Redditch. P.S. she writes, "I found this beneath the sofa cushion. Is it one of yours?" And yeah, she's enclosed a little Subbuteo player there for some strange reason. Anyway, here we go. Frisbee. Frisbee whizzing through the air, above our heads, over the sand, into the water, onto the waves, out to sea. You cried a lot that day. Frisbee was a lovely dog. The poem Frisbee there. Now, without wanting to get too analytical about my poetry, there are three things we've learnt already from that short and deceptively simple poem. A poem only about 9 lines long and barely 30 words, but it's a poem with an awful lot going on beneath the surface. A bit like the legs of poor Frisbee on that fateful day. Firstly, we've all learnt something about the nature of language itself, haven't we? Language is an imperfect thing. We carry the meaning of words around with us, and we assume we all have a shared understanding of what these words mean. But as we can see here in the use of the word Frisbee, it's not always necessarily the case. Secondly, we encounter the concept of the unreliable narrator. It's a poem that sets out to trick us. We think the poem is going in one direction, only for it to veer off somewhere else completely. Again, a bit like Frisbee on that terrible, terrible afternoon. The third thing it makes us think about is the concept of nominative determinism, the idea that one's name may shape one's destiny. In fact, I still wonder what might have happened if we'd chosen a different name for him. Maybe he'd be with us today, for instance, if we'd called him Boomerang. or Steve. But that's the thing about words. There are lots of words to choose from. And with so many words around us, one of the key questions for the modern poet is how to choose the right ones. Now this next poem is all about words, and anyone who's familiar with my work will know that I'm very interested in form and structure and how they might marry up with the themes and subjects of my writing. And here's a good example of that here. Because not only is this poem about words, but I've actually used words with which to write it. And it's called Roget's Thesaurus. In order to grow, expand, widen his lexicological corpus, Roger bought, acquired, purchased a synonymopedia, a thesaurus. Soon, presently, without delay, he no longer ran out of things to say, speak, utter, express, articulate, give voice to, pronounce, communicate. It was all very well, fine, great, wonderful, super, terrific, but his friends, mates, pals thought him boring, tedious, dull, soporific. So let this be a warning, an omen, a sign, a premonition. It's all very well to show learning, education, knowledge, erudition. But here's a top tip, a suggestion, some advice. Don't ever let it stop you from being concise. Brief, short, clear, pithy, succinct, compendious, to the point. Breviloquent. Now, both Frisbee and Roget's Thesaurus appeared in my first collection, You Took the Last Bus Home, a book which courted controversy when it was first published for the eroticism of some of the verse. Originally, the publisher, Unbound, debated whether it should have one of those stickers on the front of it which said, parental consent necessary, explicit lyrics. Not because it contains any, of course, but they thought it might just sell more copies that way. Anyway, here's one of my racier poems. Anyone of a sensitive disposition might want to avert their ears for a minute or two. It's called Chore-play. Let's make love as soon as we are able. When the plates are cleared from the table, the dishwasher stacked neatly and the surfaces completely wiped clean of crumbs and yolk, we can leave the pans to soak. Let's make our love fast and urgent. Once I bought some more detergent, because the backlog of laundry is simply quite extraordinary. We really should do it oftener. I'll also get some fabric softener. Let our bodies writhe and manoeuvre when I've finished with the hoover. I know that it's rather late, but the house is in a state and our schedule has got off kilter. I think we need to change the filter. Let our love be reckless, exciting. After I've done the recycling. The lilac sack securely tied and placed in the street outside, careful not to cause obstruction. And so begins the sweet seduction. The more observant of you may have noticed that the recycling sacks in that poem are described as lilac. However, anyone with even just a rudimentary knowledge of the Oxford City Waste Collection Services Department, which is my local waste collection service department, will know that recycling sacks are actually blue. Lilac sacks are reserved for landfill only and thus will not be collected on recycling days. So why, you may ask, have I made such a basic mistake in my poem? Well, the simple answer is that I haven't. It's quite deliberate. Not only does the bisyllabic nature of the word lilac fit better with the poem's metre, it also indicates the narrator's kind of mental and emotional turmoil as he contemplates the night of passion and ecstasy that awaits him. Once, of course, all the chores have been completed. Time now for another listener's request. This one's been sent in by a Mrs. Edith Bilston from Redditch. Dear Brian, she writes, as an erstwhile fan of yours, I was wondering if you might read Caveman's Lament, your fabulous translation what is considered to be the world's oldest surviving love poem. I don't know much more about it than this, but perhaps you could use this letter as a crude fictional device to enable you to move on from the last poem to this one. P.S. Your Britannia Music Club albums are still being sent to the house. Your father's been storing them in the garage for the time being, but he's running out of space. So thanks very much to the listener there for requesting the Caveman's Lament. I was flattered to be asked by the linguistics and archaeology departments of Oxford University to translate this poem. It's thought to have been written by one of our earliest ancestors, Homo unrequitus, about 1.5 million years ago. The poem itself was found carved into a rock next to a little chef on the ring road just outside Hemel Hempstead. And here it is, the Caveman's Lament. Me think about her when sun rises. Me think about her when sun sets. Me say to her how much me love her. She tell me love invent not yet. Me make cave all warm and cosy. Me lie bearskin on cave floor. Me play song of love on bone flute. She choose cave of Tim next door. Me no more go out hunt mammoth. Me throw spear too short or long. Me sit in cave. Me paint her picture. She say me got perspective wrong. Me cook meal to show me love her. Diplodocus with fried beans. She say food anachronistic. Me not know what this means. Stone Age mighty hard for lovers. Yet rub two flints, look what you get. Small sparks lead to big inferno. But she say love invent not yet. I posted that poem up on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and generally it was well received. Well, at least I thought it was. But then one person responded to it in this fashion. She wrote, "I know this is supposed to be cute, but it fills me with all kinds of rage." Now, I must admit to feeling slightly worried about this. I kind of checked the poem again for typos, but I couldn't really see any. I wondered whether she was taking issue with the quality of my translation. But anyway, she went on to clarify the precise kinds of rage she was being filled with. All kinds of rage, she said, regarding the history of writing, how poetry works, and what we know about the development of language. 23 people liked this comment. She went on to discuss the sophistication of the ancient Sumerian language and the depth and complexity that accompanied the writing of that civilization. I must admit, I felt a little sorry for my caveman, pouring his heart out like that, yet failing it seemed to get the girl, and on top of that, now having 23 people in the 21st century having a go at him on social media, pointing out the inferiority of his words compared with the glories of Sumerian poetry, which emerged from a civilization that came more than 1 million years after him. It all seemed rather unfair somehow. But then again, who knows what may survive of us to inform future generations as to what we were really like? I would worry, for instance, if the only surviving artefact of our current time was to be this book, Diary of a Somebody. What would future generations make of it all? Particularly the author of the diary entries, a kind of middling, muddling poet called Brian. I mean, just take this poem that we find him writing on January the 26th, for instance, entitled, "This is not the poem that I'd hoped to write." This is not the poem that I had hoped to write. When I sat at my desk and the page was white, you see, there were other words that I'd had in mind, yet this is what I leave behind. I thought it was a poem to eradicate war, one of such power it would heal all the sores of a world torn apart by conflict and schism. But it isn't. Lovers, I'd imagine, would quote from it daily, Mothers would sing it to soothe crying babies, and whole generations would be given new hope. Nope. I had grand aspirations. Believe me, I tried. Humanity examined, with lessons applied. But the right words escaped me. So often they do. Have these in lieu. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to clarify something. Any resemblance between the Brian Bilston you encounter in this book and the Brian Bilston speaking to you today is entirely coincidental. We are very different people. For example, it's clear that the Brian Bilston of the diary is something of a shambolic figure and altogether something of a loser. Just contrast that with the man you see before you now. The Brian of the diary is a man whose life is governed by a series of regulated events. Foremost amongst these is his monthly poetry club. I'd like to read you a brief extract from the diary now, from the first time we encounter Poetry Club in January. And the entry starts, as many of the entries do, with a short poem. So here we go. Tuesday, January the 9th. Poetry Club. The first rule of Poetry Club is that we meet each month in the pub. The second rule of Poetry Club is that not all poems have to rhyme. That's the end of the poem. And Brian goes on to write, contrary to popular stereotype, poets are hardy creatures. Neither Arctic blizzards nor desert sandstorms, mighty earthquakes nor rampaging tornadoes are likely to get much in the way of a poet with the opportunity to read their work to an audience with no obvious means of escape. Consequently, there was full attendance at Poetry Club in spite of the evening's bitter cold. Mary got proceedings off to a poignant start with a requiem to her husband Leonard, who tragically died in the Falklands. This was not during hostilities, as it turns out, but falling off a cliff while attempting to photograph a colony of rockhopper penguins. Leonard, as we've learnt over the years, was her third husband of 6. The sequence runs as follows: divorced, bewildered, died, divorced, befuddled, surprised. Next it was the turn of Douglas, who launched into a ballad concerning rival sea captains at the Battle of Lepanto of 1571. This he attempted to bring to life with a sequence of nautical actions and sound effects. 20 minutes in, and with no end in sight, we were able to coax him down with a double rum and coke during a particularly heavy spell of cannon fire. Chandramar captivated us with a poem about a doomed love affair between a wealthy Delhi merchant prince and a serving girl, followed by a brief meditation on the movements of the moon. And then, in a sudden change of pace and tone, Cayley treated us to a very impassioned spoken word piece about urban decay, rape and abortion, which made us all rather quiet and reflective for a while. I did my best to lighten the mood with a few poems about Piers Morgan, bus journeys and the seasonal migration of ice cream vans. As ever, I could sense Toby Salt sneering at me from his seat in the corner and trying to distract the others in the middle of my usual hesitant, stumbling performance. Toby Salt is very dismissive of my work. He claims it lacks gravitas and soul. As Carl Sandburg once said, he declared pompously at our last meeting, poetry should be an echo, asking a shadow to dance. 3 years of studying creative writing at Bath Spa University, and he thinks he knows it all. Toby Salt is very much Brian's poetry nemesis. He's everything that Brian is not. He's successful, he's critically acclaimed, he's frequently on the radio and television and sort of reviewing books for newspapers. And he's on the verge of publishing his first collection of poetry, This Bridge No Hands Shall Cleave, with a trendy poetry publisher called Shooting from the Hip. And while Toby Salt's star seems to be permanently on the rise, Brian, on the other hand, often struggles to find the right words with his poetry. It doesn't stop him from trying to dispense advice to other writers, though. Take this poem from the 17th of January, called How to Avoid Mixing Your Metaphors. It's not rocket surgery. First, get all your ducks on the same page. After all, you can't make an omelette without breaking stride. Be sure to watch what you write with a fine-tuned comb. Check and recheck until the cows turn blue. It's as easy as falling off a piece of cake. Don't worry about opening up a whole hill of beans. You can always burn that bridge when you come to it if you follow where I'm coming from. Concentrate. Keep your door closed and your enemies closer. Finally, don't take the moral high horse. If the metaphor fits, walk a mile in it. And then into Brian's rather miserable and squalid existence comes Liz. She walks into Brian's life in February when she attends the Simmering Cauldron that is monthly poetry club. She quickly becomes the subject of Brian's romantic interest and erotic daydreams. An example of the latter we find on the 1st of May, in which Brian writes, "The erotic dreams have returned. I'd misused a semicolon. Liz kept me behind for corrected therapy. I was to go through a set of uncorrected proofs for a new book in the 50 Shades of Grey series, and for every mistake I found, she'd remove an item of clothing, and for each one I missed, she'd put one on. I woke up just as she was putting on a third cardigan, over her blouse, tank top, and pullover." Anyhow, now's not the time for me to tell you about how it all works out with Liz, but suffice to say, Brian does his best to mess things up at almost every turn. We also learn in the diary that Brian used to be married to somebody called Sophie, and he has a son called Dylan. It's never fully explained why Brian and Sophie are no longer together, but there is a passage on the 16th of August, which I think kind of reveals what it must have been like for poor Sophie to have lived with Brian. It's another one of Brian's dreams, and he writes, "For the first time in years I dreamt about Sophie. We were arguing. I spent the day writing poems for her to find when she came back from work, scattering them around the house like confetti. She wondered why the fridge was empty when I promised I'd go shopping, why the house was in such a state when I promised to tidy up. She said it would be good if, just for once, I could drop the obsession with poetry and join the rest of us in the real world. Later, I found a post-it note she'd left on the kitchen table. It said, 'Brian, I give up. Can't live with you anymore. I am off to Mom's.' It was the saddest haiku I'd ever read." And Brian's poem for that day is entitled "The Incidents of Oxymorons." Alone together, at last, I told her how I thought that, in my unbiased opinion, the incidence of oxymorons in the English language had been growing smaller. "That's old news," she said, claiming it had been the case for almost exactly 10 years. Strongly held convictions were thrown across the room. Things got pretty ugly. But this felt strangely normal. Ours was a bittersweet relationship, a tragicomic civil war of violent agreements and deafening silences, going nowhere. Okay, I think we've got time for just one more listener's letter before I finish. Let's go for this one. Dear Brian, it says, this is from Redditch-based listener Mrs. Edith Bilston. As a long-time letter writer of clunky links between poems, I was wondering if it would be possible for you to read your poem Lord's Prayer from Diary of a Somebody. I must admit I understand none of the musical references in it, nor have I actually read the book you have asked me to plug. P.S. Please can you send the money by online bank transfer this time? It is difficult to cash cheques given current restrictions. Thanks very much for that, Edith. The Brian of the Diary goes to listen to live music on the 27th of each month with a friend, and on the 27th of February he writes this piece called The Lord's Prayer, which is very much a kind of hymn to popular music. Here it is. Our Father, John Misty, which art in Hanson, Hallowed be thy James, thy Kingston come, thy will I am, in earth, wind and fire as it is in heaven 17. Give us, green day, our motorhead, and forgive us our traverses, as wad forgive them that traverse against us. And lead us not into the temptations, but deliver us from emo. For rideth the King Crimson, to Pal and the Gloria, for everly and everly. Shaman. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been spending a lot of time in lockdown recently. And as many people have observed, given the unusual circumstances we all find ourselves in, it's very difficult to keep your mind on things and do some work. Fortunately for me, I work from home anyway, and I consider myself something of an expert about how to use time efficiently. What's important is to have a regular routine alongside a list of tasks and priorities that need to happen that day. So here's a poem about that, which I've written in the form of a to-do list, and I've called To-Do List. Delay, defer, equivocate, make some tea, procrastinate, scroll through news, stroke the cat, readjust the thermostat. Dawdle, dither, hem and haw, fill the kettle, chew my jaw, write 9 words, spin on chair, play 6 games of solitaire. Observe the merry dappled light dancing on the screen of white. Print out my words, paper scrunch, stroke the cat, break for lunch. Prioritise new tasks to shirk, resolve myself to do some work. Look at Twitter, spin on chair, make a brew, loiter, stare. Scroll through news, stare some more, reorganise the kitchen drawer. Write 9 words, cross 6 out, stroke the cat, stoke self-doubt. Make tea, stroke cat, scroll news, stare, Twitter chair spin, solitaire, stroke tea, spin news, scroll cat, wallow. Write to-do list for tomorrow. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now, but before I finish, I just want to talk very briefly about this contagion that seems to have spread itself around the world over the last few months. All continents, countries and communities have been affected by it in some way, and it's so contagious, so infectious, that it has the power to change our world utterly. I am, of course, talking about kindness, and here's a poem called Kindness. To recap what we know now, it did not begin in a laboratory in Wuhan, nor with a pangolin or bat, but it already lay dormant within us, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to thrive. Its symptoms are many and various, and may include some or all of the following: teardrops, sudden laughter, a feeling of warmth, and a peculiar uplifting of the heart. It leaves its traces everywhere, from boxes left on doorsteps to conversations over fences. It can be transmitted over vast distances, through a phone call or from a smile across a street, or a certain softness of tone spoken beside a hospital bed. It affects young and old equally. There is no race or gender immune from it. It has the power to topple bad governments. If one person were to pass it on to just 3 others, and they in turn were to pass it on to 3 more, in no time at all the world would be full of it. And where, we might ask ourselves, would we be then? Thank you. Thanks very much for listening. Good night.